Here at Psychology Ninjas, our focus today comes from learning theories and Pavlov's study. How are you going to access your AO1 explanation marks? Well, this is a study. Therefore, you need key details covering all of the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions. What does this break down into? Well, you want to try and have two aims, one about the role of conditioning reflexes and one about the association between salivation and unrelated stimuli. You want elements of the procedure that you're going to use for evaluation later on, thinking about the nature of this as a laboratory observation because that's our focus in learning theories, and also focusing on before and during conditioning, as you would do when you explain classical conditioning. Your findings come from all of the information about after conditioning and what was happening beforehand in relation to the neutral stimulus. You also want to have some quantitative data here with 45 droplets of saliva being collected in one of the trials. The conclusions here come in terms of signalization and a link in the brain between the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus. You could talk about that being a survival mechanism, and that would be a useful link to nature as well as nurture in relation to Pavlov's study. So how are you going to evaluate? Well, this is a study, so we're going down that tranche that looks at this being a grave piece of evaluation. Here, we're thinking about having our arguments and counter-arguments in order to develop logical chains of reasoning. So if we're thinking about this in relation to generalizability, yes, we're going to be talking about there's low generalizability because these participants were dogs, but it's really important here that you go that one step further. Yes, we can't generalize this to humans because of the role of motivation and that being critical in human learning. You can counter this with findings have been replicated with human participants using our classic study of Watson and Rayner. Here we're thinking about population validity and the role of motivation in learning is significant, so it lacks population validity. We can move on through then and think about this as our 8 marker, evaluate Pavlov's study into classical conditioning. Again, we want to think about interweaving our AO1 and our AO3. So first of all, you want to identify the 2 aims of this piece of research before talking about the nature of the participants. That will link you nicely into our discussion about generalizability. From here, you would outline elements of the procedure, stating that this is a standardized procedure and then giving details in order to contextualize this, making sure it's not generic. So something about the collection of the saliva, being immobilized, being through a cannula, also that the presentation of neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus was paired both forwards and backwards. We want to counter that, saying there's some variation in the pairing, and overall we can conclude that this has high internal reliability, so it is consistent within the study. We move on through then to talk about one of the findings, and we can apply this to the real world. Here you either want to talk about systematic desensitization, because that's something you're going to have to know anyway. That's a different video in terms of explaining that. Here we can talk about aversion therapy, where we're associating something negative with something that we want to stop in terms of behaviour. So maybe feeling unwell with an addictive substance, and therefore we would stop taking that addictive substance. Again, we want to counter that, saying actually this has been used to control certain groups. We could talk about behaviour modification camps here, but overall the fact that we can apply this to the real world gives Pavlov's study credibility, but also gives credibility to classical conditioning. Then we want to move on and talk about another finding. Here we can talk about the fact that there was a need for the dog to be alert and undistracted in order for the learning to occur. We're going to then talk about validity and a lack of ecological validity because this is an artificial environment, and therefore learning in the real world, even for dogs, would have had other things competing for their attention. We're going to counter that with a strength, saying having this really controlled artificial environment meant high control over extraneous variables. You want to give one here, so noise could be an extraneous variable. That was mitigated by having it in a soundproof chamber. This gives us high internal validity that they were accurately measuring the effect of the conditioned stimulus, not competing things such as sound. Finally, we're going to talk about our conclusions, here talking about signalization again. And then we can lead into ethical problems. Be really careful here because we don't want to talk about informed consent and that they're dogs and they're not giving informed consent. I know that is true, but we sound a little bit juvenile in terms of saying that. So what you want to be saying is either that the participants were given an unnecessary surgical procedure which isn't protecting them from harm, or because animal participants show problems with right to withdraw because they're animals, we need to be aware of how they might show distress as a researcher so that we can withdraw them. Overall, Pavlov's study did meet ethical guidelines, although you can talk about this was in 1927 and the guidelines now are different. Okay, let's have a look at some exam questions then. Here we've got a short mark, explain the findings of Pavlov's research into classical conditioning. If we're explaining for 2 marks, we want to give additional detail, 2 marks, 2 different findings. Let's have a look at a different exam question now. A bigger tariff question, 8 marks, evaluate, and we're still talking about Pavlov's research, but here we're focusing specifically on validity. We know with evaluate we need to explain and evaluate, so we're still getting both AO1 and AO3 marks. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.